All right. Yes, I'm last, and that is a good thing and a bad thing in more ways than one. I actually feel that I'm somewhat a fish out of water in a way in this particular symposium because I'm not necessarily trained in some of what I'm going to share, but my journey into the humanities and how they can transform society, I guess started watching and filming my grandmother, and eventually by the time she passed, I'd actually accumulated quite a good library of material that I look back to, and I'm like, man, I wish I was trained. I would have done more with it, but it's still a very good archive. The second instance is I come out of graduate school. I'm a geographer trained in economic and urban geography. That's actually where I've done most of my work. So in 2005, it's a Saturday, I'm sitting at my house and I get a call from a friend from Texas. Some of you know the historian Toyin Farola. So he calls me up and he says, you know, I gave, he's the editor of the African Culture and Customs series. So he tells me that somebody had volunteered to write a book on the culture and customs of Uganda, and I'd never been able to produce the work. So he wants me to do it. And I'm telling him, well, first of all, I don't really know much about culture and customs. I'm a geographer. You should have told me to write a book about the geography of Uganda, certainly not the culture and customs. So those of you who know him know that he listens patiently, but sometimes he doesn't really listen. So at the end of that conversation, he's like, well, I'm waiting for the first chapter by the end of next week. And so not wanting to disappoint him, I started writing one chapter, and eventually they became 7, right? Obviously having to read up and, you know, be ready for that kind of work. At the end of it, I liked enough what I'd seen and done, and I volunteered to do one on Tanzania. So I'm actually far more proud of the Tanzania volume that came out in 2013 than perhaps I am of the one that came out in 2006, partly because by then I knew my way around cultural geography, as we call it in my discipline. Now that I've ended up publishing in that area, and out of that work ended up even publishing a textbook in population geography. Along the way, I've become president of Kenya Scholars and Studies Association, and in the process of writing those 2 books, I began to realize that there's a lot we're losing in terms of indigenous knowledge. And it actually ended up forcing me to reflect on the heritage that we're losing. And I came to realize that some of the material we had been struggling with in economic geography, particularly development issues, were actually happening because we were losing the culture. You know, development, sometimes we talk of it in terms of the buildings, the cars, and the roads. But in fact, the more I have come to understand it, the more you understand that it's actually cultural development significantly. That people have to own their destiny, they have to own their history, they have to own their culture before they can actually say that they are developed. Because, and in fact, as people like Mazrui have said, if you're going to adapt Western industrialization, you also need to adapt its culture. Otherwise, it will not make sense, you know? And we see the failure of that complete adaptation in many African countries. For example, when you look at the failure of certain development experiments, it's because they're simply transplanted from here, but they're never brought with the underlying organizing frameworks that actually make them work perhaps in the Western world. So as these societies are being transformed culturally, then you are going to begin to see some of these things beginning to work, because finally you're going to have this critical marriage of culture, customs, and some of the technologies that actually people end up adapting. So as part of the leading Kefa, one of the things I've been able to emphasize over the years is basically the need to tell our own stories, because it's one thing to complain about how other people perhaps don't tell our stories correctly, but it's quite another to tell our own stories. And so even as an economic geographer, an urban geographer, who has managed to write some cultural works, and I'm actually currently engaged in another project of preserving the proverbs of the Gusi people, so which is actually how this project really falls right in place for me. And along the way, I've ended up doing a little bit of work in language, things that I never thought that I would actually end up doing. And so it doesn't have to be that you're trained in it, you just have to have a heart for some of these things, and then be able to contribute in that regard. So those are basically sort of like the framing elements of my talk. I only have like 3 slides because I didn't want to go long, because you don't want to go along in the middle of experts lest you embarrass yourself. So I'm going to have some rather general points to share with you, but really along the way to setting the stage for reiterating the importance of the Makleki project, and also the fact that I see a lot of potential, not just in preserving culture in Kisumu, but actually in that entire region. And actually I see it even as being a model of even some of the things I'm trying to do. Earlier on I was also quite impressed with the digital GIS. Now the GIS I know because I actually also teach GIS. So I'm like, well, I should have thought about some of these things. But as we see, you know, sometimes you go out and you learn a few things along the way. So it's been a very enriching symposium, even though initially I was like, well, I don't really know what I'm going to share, whether I'm going to add value, but perhaps even if I don't end up educating anybody, I guess I've learned a lot, and I do see some good coming out of it. So in that regard, I would have to say that the project is actually accomplishing its objectives in terms of reaching most of us. So I started with basic things. I like to keep things simple, mostly for me. So I wanted to look at, you know, for example, the sentence that you shared with us in terms of how public-facing scholarship can impact society. So I started asking myself, what the heck is public scholarship, you know? So, you know, there are many definitions, and so I thought that the simple one that I see here, you know, it's when accomplished intellectuals whose opinions and published works are well known and who frequently appear in the media to comment on newsworthy issues. And I began to actually see a little bit of myself in that, because I've been a little bit outspoken in some things, particularly diaspora issues in regard to Kenya. And MIT's Alan Lightman would define it basically as when an accomplished scholar based at a university decides to write and speak to a larger audience than their professional colleagues, or he or she becomes a public intellectual. So I also saw a little bit of myself there, because I was like, well, I'm not really a trained person in the humanities, but I've been asked to comment on a number of things. How do you think the elections are going to go? Well, I'm not an elections expert or anything, but in some ways I think that with a little bit of notoriety, you find that people expect you to have an opinion in many of these things. So Alan will differentiate 3 levels. Level 1 is speaking and writing for the public, for the public exclusively about your discipline, and every one of us actually does this from time to time, which is really the lowest level of a public intellectual, and I would imagine that every one of us should be able to do that, particularly in a day and age when, for example, simple things like funding to higher ed is under significant threat. People don't seem to think that we work. We somehow sit in some offices and they don't see how you are sitting and you're not working with your hands means anything, you know, perhaps in terms of thinking. So level 2 then is speaking and writing about your discipline and how it relates to social, cultural, and political world around you. And I would argue that actually most of us intellectuals have failed at level 2 because we like to say that we do important work, but we fail to educate the public in terms of how that work relates to actually their everyday life. And therefore, when we start to be attacked in terms of not being contributing members of society, that is basically because in some way we have failed to actually translate, you know, our high training into, you know, English, as we like to say. And this is something I found out a few years back. Somebody told me, a more accomplished public intellectual, that, you know, one of the things you need to do is that anytime you write an academic article, try to write it as a newspaper article in 700 words and make sure you publish it. And I'm here to tell you that I've actually got more mileage from my newspaper articles than from my academic work, you know, because it's forced me to go to that level 2. I mean, for somebody who never had the privilege of, you know, being a university professor, what the heck does your research on global Nairobi have to do with me, for example? And so that has had to be having to rephrase that in terms of quality of life issues that actually the ordinary person can identify with, and which then actually I think in some ways can translate into support for the craft that we do. Most of us may never get to level 3, that is by invitation only. Somebody else has to recognize you. You have to be a famous intellectual. There are not too many of them, but I think most of us can name a few in the US. Saskia Sassen, you know, for example, and some of Noam Chomsky and some of these big names that, you know, even Einstein. You are a physicist, but people want you to comment about the elections, about social issues, when in fact you're not trained in some of those areas. But I think people come to think that if you're a genius in one way, you should be able to have something intelligent to say about almost anything and everything in society. So when I look at African public intellectuals, then I wanted to find for myself one or two examples. So I saw people like the late Ali Mazrui, political scientist and provocateur, from Binghamton University. A good friend of mine, as many of you know, he passed last year. And then Wero Soyinka, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. People will argue about Ngugi sometimes, quite frankly, but he's actually done some good work. And the fact that sometimes people are arguing whether you are a public intellectual or not is itself an indication that at least you've made progress. And also people like Mahmoud Mamdani from, I believe, Uganda, a cultural anthropologist, and others like George Ayite, an economist. For example, when you look at George Ayite talk about economic development in Africa, you talk of things like the hippo generation, the lion generation, and those types of things. And you will have to use some of that language because I came to realize that when you get to level number 2, you have to communicate your craft as a story rather than in the academic speak that we like to speak. It has to be a story because that is almost the most basic level of human understanding, and everybody can identify with a story. And you notice that my comments were prefaced with a short story, how somebody calls me up on a Saturday and eventually transforms me. And I've actually since told him that I was kicking and screaming as I took on the project, but you actually helped me a lot. And remember that you really do not grow until you are stretched. So remaining in one's comfort zones is actually an easy way of stagnating and going nowhere. So sometimes we have to take on some of these challenges even when we don't feel qualified. So what do I think that these people can do? For obviously social transformation through things like activism, and we have seen one here. Thank you for the film that went right before me. You set the stage. I don't even have to. In some ways, I think I have a better understanding of social transformation through activism. Being the voice of conscience to society. And recently I did a fellowship at Kisumu University in Kenya, and one of the things I challenged them about is the need to change the deafening silence of the African academic and priest, so that most of these societies have lost their conscience. And that is because the two people that normally serve as the voice of the conscious in society have actually gone silent in many of these African societies, the academics and the priests. In Kenya, I dare you to find me somebody today, for example, that is going to be equal to Alexander Muge, for example. Find me an intellectual that stands up to the system in any meaningful way. Of course, then we want to be a voice to the voiceless, including those that may not necessarily be aware. And of course, in the area of public education and mobilization through the media, especially radio, for example. I've come to like radio and newspapers a lot because I found out those are really the main mass media of Africa. TV is not a big deal. Some of you from Kenya know that they switched off TV for like about 2-3 months, I guess, early in the year. And nobody seemed to notice. The people in Nairobi were like, we're gonna die. But the rest of the country didn't really pay attention, which tells you how little influence that medium has in Kenyan society, the fact that people didn't seem to miss it. But I dare you to turn off radio, and even newspapers. And something I found about newspapers, for example, even from the few articles that I've written, you go to some very small parts of the country and people tell you, oh, I read your article. Sometimes they will even call you and say, and I've wanted them to call me about some of my books. I'm still waiting for the call. I've actually never seen it. But you read a small commentary and in the newspaper, and people are going to pick it up and respond. So I've come to find that even if we don't have people reading books as much as we want, we should be able to reach them in the medium that they understand best. So things like radio and things like newspapers. And so some of the public debates we used to see in the Daily Nation, for example, seem to have disappeared. They're not as much nowadays as they used to be. And of course, advocating for academia, I've already mentioned that, particularly in a continent where pursuit of knowledge is a low priority, which I found out, for example, even when I was there. Intellectuals want to tell you how many plots of land they have bought, how many matatus, public transport vehicles they have, instead of talking about, for example, the number of publications. And you can understand why. This is a society our societies in general that actually worship money. And you try to tell them that even going this route through intellectual pursuit, you can actually make money begins to be a little bit difficult. And so you can see how that has become a big problem for many African countries, because in a knowledge economy, a knowledge global economy, when you're not producing knowledge, where are you living yourself? Because consumption by itself is not really going to be able to do much. Much of the money is made in production and distribution. Simply being in consumption isn't going to help much. That only helps the shopkeepers and the distributors and the rest, but the power is basically in production of knowledge. And so even as African nations and practitioners of knowledge, whether we're in the diaspora or in Africa, we need to think seriously about producing knowledge. That is actually where our legacy is in the long term, and that is how we're going to change some of these societies. To repeat what I said at Kisumu University, remember Google Earth was an idea. Google itself, the search engine, was an idea, but they are now very big companies. Apple was an idea. So that with a good idea can actually create far more money than you'll ever be able to make from almost anything. At one time, Bill Gates was making $1,000 per second. He's still one of the richest people out there. At that rate of making money just from an idea, you can begin to see why we need to get our people to believe in themselves and begin to do some of these things. And of course, part of the reason, as I've come to find, the more I begin to understand the African psyche, you notice that one of the reasons why we don't invest in knowledge production is we don't even believe in ourselves. You can actually have a silly idea from the US, people will think it's a serious idea, and a serious idea from Africa, even Africans themselves, will not necessarily take it seriously. So that some of this is actually psychological re-engineering, and some of it is actually even at the level of the religious arena, trying to get people to even believe in themselves before you can actually begin to get them to begin to be creative and produce things that will transform that continent. And then of course championing various causes, including the one that we just saw. And then I started thinking that, well, Makeleke is also a public intellectual. Of course there are intellectuals in the project, but the project itself can also actually in many ways be seen as a public intellectual. Maybe it's a stretch, but I'm going to throw it out there. It's too late anyway, it's up here. So we'll see what we can do with it. So as an entity, it can actually be a vehicle for social transformation by advocating, for example, for the preservation of local history for the sake of future generations. As George Santayana has said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I would revise that a little bit and say that they are condemned to lose it. And whenever you lose your history, you lose your identity. So the second one is how Makeleke can actually be a voice of conscience. I would argue that it's amoral not to preserve one's history. And that is something that was brought home to me, for example, when one of my grandfathers died. By then I owned a camera, but somehow I never got the time to take a picture of him. And I started counting the opportunities I missed to actually take a picture of him. And which also was more poignant, because those of you that know that these are oral societies, you basically know that when somebody like that dies, actually a library dies. It's not just a person, it's an entire library. If you were to sit him down and actually try to record some of what he knows, you'd be amazed. And so this is why we need this project. My colleagues from Kisumu, it's not just something for that you do for a job. It is actually significantly contributing to the social welfare of that society in days to come. Those are libraries that we're letting die every single day. And we need to actually preserve them even for our own good. Then of course, to be the voice to the voiceless, I wanted to think of it more in terms of people, but I thought, well, even history actually needs a voice. And so in this case, I saw history, the voiceless history, for example, as that which is ignored, that which is dying, and even more dangerously in places like Kenya, that which is silenced. Earlier on there was an indication of, for example, some of the atrocities that were committed during the British Empire. And you know that somebody published a book, Britain's Gulag, and actually it has actually ended up causing some sort of compensation for the societies that actually underwent that particular experience. So from a project, just writing up something you have ended up transforming the lives of people. So not all history, as we all know, ends up seeing the day of light. The joke, the comment I like to use in this regard, for example, remember, many of you have seen this quote that goes around on Facebook, that until the lion learns to write, the history of the hunt will always be written from the perspective of the hunter, rather than from the perspective of the lion. So we always glorify how the shot was good. You know, I hit it once. But we never stop to think how the lion might have felt as it was taking the shot. You know, and of course there are issues of power, as we all know, that are embedded within many of these societies. And even writing is not an innocent craft. It is actually a loaded craft that presents particular histories and suppresses others for particular projects of power. And in the case of Kenya, we see this, for example, having been done very skillfully, in the sense that when we focus on the national history, for example, there's now a project in Kenya of the National Cohesion Project. Don't talk about ethnicity, just talk about the nation, you know, which looks like a good idea, but in fact it is suppressing local histories. And all you have to do is go to Tanzania and see how some of these can actually be dangerous, because when you suppress a people's history in an attempt to produce a national history, you find out very soon that actually you don't do yourself a whole lot of favor, because sooner or later it comes back to bite you. We need both. You don't have to have a national history by suppressing a local history. And particularly in cases where some of these suppressed histories are suppressed because they serve the interests of those, for example, that may be in power. So that when it comes, for example, to honor national heroes, we honor people from particular communities and we don't honor people from other communities. So the governor of the county I come from the other day, I was surprised, he actually announced he was going to build monuments to local Gusii heroes, and he gave a list of 10 people I've never heard about. I only knew of one. And even when I was talking to my dad recently, actually trying to do something ethnographic, trying to see what he has been through, and we ended up with something like 60 pages of work, and eventually I learned that actually Mzee Kenyatta had actually taken refuge in Masimba, Bagaka at some point, in actually Nyachai's family, which is actually what ended up connecting that family to the national government, and you can actually see how that has produced significant rewards for them. But what about the heroes from Luoland, for example, Kurialand, you know, and all the other communities that we have in Kenya? Why is it that many of the monuments in Nairobi are from one community and not, for example, the other communities? How come we know the resistance movements of one community and not the resistance movements of the other communities, for example? And particularly in a case like in Kenya, where that is used, for example, to justify access to state resources for personal enrichment. And it isn't even ethnic groups that are enriched from that, it's actually individuals. And unfortunately, the masses are co-opted into thinking that they too are in power, even when they have to use flying toilets in Kibera, while those that are keeping them down are using modern toilets in Westlands. As somebody told me when I was doing field work for my PhD, you know, you don't count, we are in power. What he didn't know is that I was living in a very comfortable place, you know, at the time, even though I didn't necessarily come from the communities of power. And I'm looking at him like, you're really out of your mind, you know, that you somehow ended up in a position where you are pretty much in agreement with your own suffering. Of course, my hope is that in documenting some of these local histories, we can actually begin to correct some of the injustices that we see in our communities. And obviously then there is the notion of public education and awareness of local history, and the need to preserve it, which I think is what McClelkey is trying to do, and which I think should be adopted across the country. And obviously there's also the notion of academic advocacy. And notice that, for example, a project like McClelkey can actually document the relevance of history to our communities. And I say this with a heavy heart because I was at the University of Nairobi barely last month, and a colleague of mine in geography told me, you know, because I was trying to start a geography department at Kisii, and I was asking him for best practices. And along the way, he mentions in passing that, you know, by the way, you have to be very careful that geography in Kisii does not die the way we have seen in other places. Even here at the University of Nairobi, the Department of History is dying because kids are no longer taking these courses because they don't see history as being bankable, you know? So which is a very short-sighted way of looking at history. But before we criticize the kids for not taking history, have we demonstrated the relevance of history to them? Do they know that a knowledge of their history is actually one of the most empowering things that they can do. Because if they knew that, we wouldn't need to justify the existence of the Department of History at the University of Nairobi. And I think that Makleki can help with some of that. Thank you.